In Canada, it's becoming more and more challenging to live, and that's according to the average working class citizen. Take a look at this graph that showcases the impact of rising prices on Canadians by income in 2024. The graph was prepared by data collected from the Canadian Social Survey. Right off the bat, you'll notice that those in the lowest and second to lowest income bracket are struggling to meet everyday needs because of the cost of living crisis. It really is becoming more and more difficult to live in Canada, and the results are right there. But how did we get here, and when did Canada turn its back on its workers? In late 2024, IPSOS conducted a poll asking Canadians if they were optimistic about what lied ahead and as the new year rolled around. Most of them, that's about 51%, were hopeful that 2025 would be better. You can take a look at the results yourself. IPSOS conducted its study with a sample population of 1,001 participants, all over the age of 18. You just saw the results that reflected 51% of the population's optimism for 2025, right? Well, there was another number there, 66%. Now, what was that all about? Well, while everyone was optimistic, 66% believed that the next year would be better for them, and 51% believed that it would be better for them and the country. Those odds don't seem that great now that you have the bigger picture, right? But why were Canadians, despite overall being optimistic for the future, less than willing to bet on 2025 being Canada's year? Well, that might have something to do with another IPSOS poll that asked people what they believed was the top story for Canada in 2024. Take a look at those results. 71% believed that the cost of living crisis made headlines in 2024, followed by 40% who believed that homelessness was the talk of the town, and then 37% who believed that it was the Canada Post strike that really had everyone talking. The discrepancy between first, second, and third place is obvious here. The cost of living crisis quite literally wins by a mile. Daryl Bricker, the global CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs, elaborated on the findings, saying, quote, "The challenge of getting by financially from day to day is the fundamental preoccupation of Canadians. It's not surprising that cost of living shows up as the number one domestic story." But before we move on any further, let's talk about the cost of living crisis as a whole. More specifically, what it is and how is it any different than having to squeeze your budget by a little bit. The big issue defines the cost of living crisis as a socioeconomic crisis. That's right, this isn't the same as having to cut back on groceries for a month or two, trading the usual stuff for something from the dollar bin or anything of that sort. Why? Well, because that's just a temporary fix until things get better. Your overall quality of life isn't impacted, but it is when there's a cost of living crisis. To elaborate on this a little further, think back to 20 years from now, or even way longer back. The cost of a dozen eggs was a whole lot less, wasn't it? That being said, you can still afford a dozen eggs. That's because while the cost of groceries has indeed gone up over the years, so has the nominal wage. That is, inflation doesn't really go down, more so the economy cannot function if there is deflation. Instead, to make it work, quote unquote, wages are increased concurrent to inflation hikes. That's something called the wage push inflation. By raising wages and then raising inflation, yes, the price of a dozen eggs does go up, but you do not necessarily feel the difference. That's because your standard of living, the scrambled eggs you have every morning, stays the same. Now, imagine if that weren't the case and you had to go to work on an empty stomach because you couldn't afford eggs. In that case, your standard of living has just changed. The cost of purchasing eggs has gone so far up that your salary doesn't match it, resulting in you have to budget around it. This isn't a squeeze. This isn't necessarily temporary either. It's something that's often defined by economists as a risk to public health. That's the cost of living crisis, and Canada's facing it. There's another thing that we have to address though before moving further, and that's the fact that inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. While often blamed for the cost of living crisis, there actually is such a thing as good inflation. In fact, inflation itself is what drives the economy. It encourages spending, driving various sectors in the economy, and keeps the supply chain moving. According to the Federal Reserve, the ideal rate of inflation is 2%. And now, with that in mind, we'll take a second here to let you guess Canada's inflation rate for 2024. That's right. Bear in mind that 71% of the population believe that the cost of living crisis was the top story of Canada in 2024. Now, do you have that number that you're going to guess on? Odds are that you're probably thinking of a number higher than 2%, the ideal rate, right? Well, you'll be surprised to know that Canada closed its fiscal year in November of 2024 with an inflation rate of 1.9%. That's less than the predicted rate of 2%. Even then, as the quarterly fiscal reports were coming in, Canada's inflation rate for 2024 stayed consistent, save for November, at 2%. Again, that's the ideal rate. So something's not adding up here. How come Canadians are complaining of a problem that seemingly doesn't exist? Well, it's obvious that it does, but then that would suggest that the numbers are wrong, wouldn't it? To better understand what's going on here, let's take a look at this table. Now, this is a table produced by the Hub using information from Statistics Canada from March of 2021 to March of 2024. Here, you can see that the price rise for items such as foodstuffs has gone up by 21.4% over the last 3 years. So, the fact of the matter is that Canada did see a 2% overall inflation hike in 2024, but it's also true that Canadians experienced a cost of living crisis just the same. This has to do with several factors, namely supply chain constraints that take us back to 2019, aka when the world effectively shut down during the global pandemic. People were forced to stay inside for months, leading to a temporary halt in the usual driving the economy process. People weren't spending money necessarily to hoard any, but because the government had ordered a complete lockdown. Once the restrictions were eased, there were people wanting more things than that which was being produced. This resulted in a disruption of the supply chain process. According to the US Federal Reserve, what kicked off 2024's spike in inflation was the unprecedented supply chain disruptions from COVID-19. Factory closures, transportation delays, labor shortages all came together to reduce supply for many products that resulted in raised production costs. But it's been years since the lockdown has ended, yet inflation continues to be on the rise and things haven't gone back to pre-pandemic levels yet. That's because when one problem dies down, another one springs up. Now we have to talk about geopolitical issues that are contributing to the cost of living crisis. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine drove energy, fertilizer, and global commodity prices upwards, causing a 1.2% increase in Canada's inflation. Then, of course, there's the crisis going on in the Middle East, fresh rounds of US tariffs on China, the potential for Donald Trump to further upend the trade order, and the list goes on and on. So, how much is 6.8% in real terms? To clarify, 6.8% was Canada's unemployment rate in November of 2024. This number seems small enough considering the bigger picture, right? How much could 6.8% really be? Well, 6.8% reflects about 1.5 million of Canada's population, and per reports, 54,000 people were added to this unfortunate statistic in November alone. The number of unemployed people, and that's those looking for work or on temporary layoff, increased by 87,000 by 2024, bringing the total number of unemployed persons to 1.5 million. On a year-over-year basis, the number of unemployed people was up by 276,000 people. Take a look at this graph presented by Labor Statistics. It tracks unemployment rates over the past 10 years. Yeah, there's a notable spike around May of 2020. That was when unemployment reached an unprecedented spike at 14% during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what we're focused on right now is another spike towards the tail end of this graph. November 2024, when it clocked in at 6.8%. It's important to remember that May 2020 spike, or any spike between 2020 and 2021, wasn't necessarily taken into account by the Daily when they claimed that unemployment has been the highest in 2024 since 2017. Yes, unemployment was higher during the pandemic, but that's the key word, the pandemic. The world has since had a chance to catch up, so the question becomes, why hasn't Canada caught up to pre-pandemic levels? Well, let's take a look at what the Bank of Canada has to say about it first. The rise in the unemployment rate largely reflects the challenges faced by newcomers and youths who have had a harder time finding work than others in the labor force. While these groups make up only about a quarter of the labor force, they account for roughly 3/4 of the increase in the unemployment rate. This can be best seen through this graph. Here, you'll notice the number of newcomers in the labor force over the years, a noticeable spike through 2023 and into 2024. So that's the Bank of Canada's explanation for the high unemployment rates. There are simply more people looking for jobs than jobs themselves. Concurrently, the Bank of Canada claims that businesses aren't laying people off, and there haven't been a significant number of business shutdowns since the pandemic veered off. Right now, it's just a matter of things going back to normal, and they will soon enough. The Bank of Canada's assessment is a statistical overview of facts, figures, and numbers. People in this assessment are represented through numbers. But what if we were to ask those numbers themselves? What I mean by that is, what if we took this discussion over to Reddit and see what Canadians over there have to say? Because Redditors have debated to no end on why unemployment in Canada is worse than it looks, here are some of the things Redditors had to say. Quote, how many of those created jobs are actually real positions and not some fake hiring scheme for tax credits or immigration? How many of those jobs are good paying jobs rather than, say, entry-level fast food? End quote. In hindsight, those are fair questions, because circling back to the Daily's report on unemployment in Canada, the report also highlighted how there'd been a rise in retail jobs in 2024. The fact is, however, that retail jobs are largely considered entry-level jobs with nominal pay. Additionally, we've already discussed how the cost of living crisis isn't a product of wage push inflation. Let's take a look at what another Redditor had to say. Quote, what we'll see now, and I am speaking largely anecdotally now as a Toronto-born white-collar professional that now works abroad, is a brain drain where those who are able to financially work in the US will go there ASAP. This is an absolute disaster long-term with implications for the future growth of the city that I don't think anyone is really seriously considering. End quote. Comparing the United States to Canada, yes, it's true that inflation has risen significantly more in the US with 2.7% over 2024 than Canada's 2%. However, the overall increase in all items from 2021 to 2024 is still less than what Canada has been experiencing. Additionally, according to Business Insider, while the United States is on the brink of a cost of living crisis, it isn't there yet. Canada, on the other hand, is already there. Immigrants, an often controversial word in the 21st century in practically every country on the planet. However, this word has more so been associated with negative connotations in the Western world. That is, in the Eurozone, the United States, and of course, in Canada. Immigrants have had to bear the brunt of a number of issues, and Canadian immigrants have been blamed for the cost of living crisis in several ways, namely the accusation that suggests they're the ones stealing their jobs. 2024 was the year of the Canada-India diplomatic row. The row was kicked off by the assassination of a Sikh separatist on Canadian soil, a matter that sparked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's statements suggesting Indian agents were involved. The matter escalated, and soon enough, Canada imposed restrictions that many Indian immigrants living in the country claimed were discriminatory. Elsewhere, however, Canadians believed that those restrictions were a long time coming. Per the Government of Canada's travel advisory, Canadians are told to exercise a high degree of caution when visiting India, something that wasn't the case in 2022, so what happened? Well, let's take a look at this image right here. What do you see? Initially, you'd think it's nothing more than an image of several people waiting in a line, and you'd be right. But what are they waiting in line for? All of these people are in line waiting for a job at Tim Hortons. According to Reddit, a majority of people here are Indian students. From spring of 2025, candidates will no longer receive additional points for having a job offer under Canada's renewed express entry system, a move aimed at curbing fraudulent practices in immigration. According to the Canadian government, this measure would help prevent the illegal buying and selling of labor market impact assets, which some candidates use to improve their chances of being selected for permanent residency. The change will apply to all candidates in the express entry pool, including new applicants, but will not impact on those who have already been invited to apply or applications in progress. Mark Miller, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, said the measure reinforces the integrity of the immigration system while ensuring the country continues to attract skilled talent. Express Entry is Canada's flagship application system for permanent immigration under programs like the Federal Skilled Worker Program, Federal Skilled Trades Program, and Canadian Experience Class, as well as parts of the Provincial Nominee Program. So, how is it discriminatory against Indian immigrants? According to Indian media outlets, Trudeau's government implemented the changes during the diplomatic row between the two nations. In 2024, and for several years now, Indians have made up the largest foreign-born population in Canada. Indian media outlets are therefore referring to the changes in Canada's immigration policies, likewise the 24-hour working cap for students, as discriminatory. But Canadians believe that it's about time for a change, especially the working class. According to The Hub, the answer is yes. Although Canada has avoided consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, the country has been on perpetual recession watch, especially after 2024's reports were read. The long-anticipated downturn is set to materialize in 2025. Employment growth, excluding the public sector, has weakened, and unemployment is rising. In November 2024, the Canadian economy added 51,000 jobs, but 45,000 of those came from the public sector. Despite tax breaks and cash handouts from federal and provincial governments, consumers will likely hold back on spending due to ongoing cost pressures. Meanwhile, business investment and productivity remains sporadic at best. So I guess the biggest question is, what does the future hold for Canada? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.